Good evening and welcome to the Santa Fe Institute Community Lecture Series. I'm Mahzarin Banaji. I am an experimental psychologist. I live usually in the town of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I have the great honor of being affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute and the great pleasure of spending several weeks each year in your fair city. As many of you know, Santa Fe's SFI's community lectures offer a window into the Institute's research to understand the common patterns in physical, computational, biological, and social complex systems that underlie the most profound issues facing science and society today. This year's lecture series focuses on individual and collective human behavior. Please note that the next lecture in this series will be held on August 15th, delivered by Nathan Collins, entitled The People Decide, Sort of. This particular lecture today is sponsored by the Peters Family Foundation, and the series is made possible with support from the Los Alamos National Bank. Today, our speaker is Duncan Watts, who is going to challenge our reliance on common sense. Common sense, as your grandfather surely told you, is a sound and prudent judgment based on a simple perception of the situation or facts. There's nothing wrong with common sense when it is applied to cases that need nothing more than simple perceptions of the situations or facts. But Duncan Watts will show us that when applied in domains marked by complexity, such as the many decisions of governments, the military, of financial institutions thinking about the housing market, or of so-called marketing geniuses who tell us about what to sell and how to sell it, reliance on common sense can be not only useless, it can be disastrous. This is a message that I heartily endorse, coming as I do from the discipline of experimental psychology, which for the past few decades has documented the trouble that arises from reliance on a cousin of common sense called intuition. Okay? Intuition can be very compelling, but more often than not, my field tells us it is neither accurate nor right. As you'll see, Duncan Watts has had a career that is among the most obvious of career trajectories. He has been a midshipman in the Royal Australian Navy. Then, as an obvious leap, he got a PhD in theoretical and applied mathematics. Then, as a natural progression, into a professorship in sociology at Columbia University. And then the next obvious step to working at Yahoo and now at Microsoft, where he is currently principal researcher. Anybody with common sense could have seen this career emerging. But it's this diversity of training and interests that makes Duncan a unique individual, I would argue, in all of science. He cares about the individual and the group. He shows us how the ordinary is more important than the extraordinary, indeed why what seems to be extraordinary, the Mona Lisa, the Harry Potter series, even Paul Revere, can be explained in terms of the more mundane social forces that surround it, not the thing itself. Duncan has data showing that whether you pay me $40,000 a year, $100,000 a year, or $1 million a year, counter to common sense, I'll do work of roughly equal value. And always feel slightly underpaid. He suggests that marketers may be better off not paying Kim Kardashian to tweet to her 1 million followers, given the costs of paying her, compared to the ordinary folks who can do much more of the same. In doing so, Duncan Watts shines a bright, high wattage light on so many of the most important problems of our time. He says in his book, bad things happen not because we forget to use our common sense, but rather because the incredible effectiveness of common sense in solving the problems of everyday life causes us to put faith in it more than it can bear. This is a message that is important, it is counterintuitive, and I believe that it is of great urgency that we know it. Let us welcome Duncan back to Santa Fe, where he was a postdoc at the Institute and then external professor, to speak about how we get duped by common sense. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you, Mazrin, for that wonderfully detailed introduction. In fact, it was so detailed that she pretty much gave my talk for me, so I don't really have anything left to tell you. Nevertheless, I'll try to repeat what Mazrin just said and explain to you a little bit. I don't normally get such great introductions, so usually I have to sort of say a little bit about myself to put some context behind what I'm about to say. So as she just mentioned, I began life, as many people at the Santa Fe Institute did, as a physicist. Over 20 years ago, I graduated from the Australian Defence Force Academy and the University of New South Wales, and I wrote my undergraduate thesis back then on what was a very hot topic at the time called chaos theory. And sort of inspired by my interest in this field, I moved in 1993 over here to Cornell University, where I did my PhD in theoretical and applied mechanics. And over the course of that 4 years, I went from being interested in chaos theory to another topic that back in the mid-1990s was not a hot topic, but has subsequently become much, much hotter even than chaos theory, which is the mathematical structure of social networks. And then, motivated by this sort of interest and increasing sort of fascination with the social and economic applications of network science, I became a sociologist, and I taught, well, actually after a couple of postdoc stints, one of which was here in Santa Fe in 1998, I ended up teaching sociology at Columbia University for several years. And just as I was becoming comfortable thinking of myself as a sociologist, having had no training in the field, I decided to leave Columbia and join first Yahoo Research and now Microsoft Research, where mostly I work with computer scientists. And so the reason that I'm giving you this sort of elaborate backstory is that all of this sort of moving to and from among the disciplines from physics to sociology and then to computer science has given me something of both an insider's and an outsider's perspective on social science. And over the last several years, I've begun to sort of wonder increasingly about this question of why is it that we treat social problems, the kinds of problems that sociologists study, very differently from the way we treat other problems in science. And so if you don't quite understand what I mean by that, I want you to cast your minds back possibly to your undergraduate years, where I'm guessing that many of you would have taken at least one course in the human behavior, right? So think about psychology or political science or sociology or economic history. And you may or may not have found the questions that you encountered in these courses interesting. But I'm guessing that you did not find them difficult in the same way that you found the questions in your physics classes or even in your biology classes difficult. And so this sort of sense that social problems involving people and human behavior are not hard in the same way that problems in physics are hard manifests itself in this phrase that here we have Bill Frist, the former Republican senator from Tennessee, writing in the New York Times an op-ed piece about fixing the healthcare system, right? And somewhere sort of midway through this 800-word op-ed piece, he says, listen, this is not rocket science. And I think that this is something that many or maybe all of us have said at some point in our lives when we're sort of stuck on some problem. We look around the room, we say, listen, people, let's sort of, we must be able to figure this out. This is not rocket science. And whenever I hear this phrase, I'm always a little sort of baffled by it, because the thing is, we're really good at rocket science. When NASA sends a satellite to orbit Jupiter hundreds of millions of miles away, it just goes where it's supposed to go, and it does what it's supposed to do, and it arrives exactly on time, and it fulfills its mission. Even when NASA screws up, right, the errors that they make are instructive. So back in 1999, they sent the Mars Climate Orbiter to orbit the planet Mars, and it turned out it crashed because of an embarrassing error that Lockheed Martin, one of the contractors, had used imperial units rather than metric units. And so they screwed up their calculations as a result, and nobody checked this. and it went into orbit at 50 kilometers rather than 150 kilometers, and it got dragged in by the planet's gravity, and it crashed, and the mission was a total failure. Now, this was deeply embarrassing to NASA, as it should have been, but think about it. You know, Mars is about 230 million kilometers from Earth, and so the error that they made in terms of this sort of where the orbiter finally arrived is about 5/10,000ths of a percent, right? So let's just sort of contrast, hold that magnitude of error in your mind. That's an embarrassing failure in rocket science, 5/10,000ths of a percent. And now you think about, John Wanamaker, the department store magnate, who was famously credited with having said, "Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I just don't know which half," right? So, everybody laughs about that, but the shocking thing about that quote is that he said it about 100 years ago, right? So this is when Einstein is putting the finishing touches on general relativity. This is before we even had rocket science, right? Before we had rockets. 100 years later, advertisers are essentially in the same position, where they have tremendous difficulty measuring the effectiveness of the advertising campaigns that they create. Even worse, more than 200 years after the foundation of the Republic, we still argue vociferously about the role of government and whether it can actually solve through its policies the kinds of problems that we encounter in society and in economics. After hundreds of years of political and social and economic theory, we are manifestly unable to predict the next financial crisis or the next political crisis, as the last few years have demonstrated very clearly. After several decades and trillions of dollars of economic development programs in the developing world, even the advocates and the architects of these programs have tremendous difficulty demonstrating their effectiveness. At a more prosaic level, in various cultural industries, experts with lots of experience and lots of skin in the game have demonstrated tremendous difficulty in being able to predict the next hit book or movie, and the same goes for analysts with respect to the next blockbuster company. And finally, after thousands of years of educating our children, we still can't agree on how to do it and what the problems are when we fail. So if we think about this sort of disjuncture, this sort of large gap between what we've been able to accomplish over the last few hundred years in the physical sciences and the engineering sciences, and what we've been able to accomplish in the social sciences, it seems all the more striking that in spite of all of this, rocket science still seems hard, and social science still seems like a matter of common sense. And the resolution of this paradox, of the answer to this question that I want to pose to you tonight, is that it has to do with the nature of common sense itself. So what is common sense? Well, if you're like me, people send you things like this all the time. I think everyone in my lab has gotten this from some well-intentioned relative. So the thing about common sense that should give you pause is that everybody thinks they know what it is, but nobody can agree. And whenever this happens, you should think, you should suspect that in fact nobody really knows. Tonight I'm going to go with Dilbert, and I'm going to say that common sense is what we use and what we rely on to navigate concrete, everyday situations. So what do I mean by that? Well, I look around the audience tonight and I notice that none of you have shown up in your swimwear, which is great, but I'm guessing that when you went to your wardrobe this morning or this afternoon or wherever you picked out your outfit for this evening, you didn't have to sort of struggle with the swimwear versus the street clothes, right? It wasn't something that you even had to think about. It never would have occurred to you to show up in your trunks this evening. It would just be sort of a violation of common sense to do that. The same sort of sense that we use to decide what to wear also applies to how we behave, in front of our bosses versus our co-workers versus our children versus our friends at the bar on a Friday night. The way we even speak in different contexts changes subtly depending on all sorts of things that are going on. So it's perfectly normal for me to be standing here talking to you at this volume and in this tone of voice, But if I approach you in the lobby afterwards and I start talking to you like this, it's going to seem really weird, right? It's going to seem like I don't quite understand how to interact socially, like I lack common sense. So I live in New York City, and I'm sure many of you have visited there, and it's a big place. And what you don't really think about when you're navigating the city on a everyday basis is that you're obeying all kinds of rules that you don't even know exist until someone breaks them, right? So, as an example, who's been to New York? Who's ridden the subway in New York City? Right, so you know that at rush hour it can get incredibly crowded, right? So people are sort of jammed in all around you, and it's not pleasant, but it's okay, right? You have to do that to get where you're going. But if you imagine being on an empty subway car and somebody comes and stands right next to you, it would be very, very strange. It would be like they just broke a rule, but you didn't even know that rule existed until they broke it. And the same is true for elevators. Try getting in an elevator and facing everybody else instead of the door, and see what they do. It's going to be extremely awkward, I guarantee you. We also have all kinds of rules about how to negotiate various kinds of economic and social transactions. So a very sort of simple but striking example of this is next time you go to dinner at your friend's house, try leaving a tip. Right? You've just crossed the line between a social transaction and an economic transaction. Now, if you were sort of a robot trying to figure out human behavior, and you went out to dinner at restaurants and you learned that it was polite to leave tips, you would just think that was the right thing to do. I'm going to leave a tip for my friend. But it would be deeply insulting. And if that doesn't work for you, think about sex. So common sense is this wonderfully powerful form of human knowledge, right? And having spent several years thinking about it, I actually have tremendous respect for common sense and what it can do for us. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that it is so effective and so reliable at helping us get through these everyday concrete situations that I'm talking about, that we attempted to use it to reason about human behavior wherever it manifests itself, including in situations that are not concrete everyday situations. So if you think about all these problems that I mentioned, things like managing the economy, designing a marketing campaign, planning some corporate strategy, predicting the success of a company, these are not concrete everyday situations. Rather, they are all problems that involve huge numbers of people who are very different from one another, who are distributed over time and space, interacting with each other in often very complicated ways. These are the quintessence of complex systems, the kinds of things that many people study at the Santa Fe Institute. And when it comes to these kinds of systems, there's no reason to think that the kind of logic, the sort of form of knowledge that we use that works so well in everyday situations is going to work for these kinds of situations. And in fact, it suffers from a number of systematic errors. So it turns out this is a problem that sociologists have worried about for a long time. And so as long ago as 1947, the great American sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld, who was at Columbia at the time, spent most of his career at Columbia, wrote this very interesting article. It was a book review that was published in the American Journal of Sociology. And the book that he was reviewing was called The American Soldier. And it was an enormous study that was commissioned by the US War Department, where they got a bunch of sociologists and they sent them in to the Army, and they interviewed about 600,000 soldiers, a massive project. And then they wrote up all their findings in a 2-volume book, and Lazarsfeld is writing a review of this book. But he uses this review to do something interesting, to make a comment about social science itself. And so the way he does this is he summarizes a number of results from this study. And so the second one that he gives is the finding from the study that men from rural backgrounds fared better than men from cities. And Lazarsfeld then steps back from his review and imagines what a reader might feel when they read these results. And Lazarsfeld imagined reader says, this is kind of obvious, right? Men from rural backgrounds, they're used to hard living, they're used to sleeping on the ground, they're used to getting up with the sun, they're used to physical labor. Why did I need such a vast and expensive study to tell me what I could have figured out using my own common sense? And Lazarsfeld says, That's a good point, except that all the results I told you were exactly the opposite of what the study actually found. In fact, it was city men who fared better in the army, not rural men. Now, of course, had Lazarsfeld told his imaginary reader the real answer to begin with, she could have reconciled that with other things that she thought she knew. She could have said, well, of course men from the city did better than men from rural backgrounds. They're used to working in large, vertically integrated, hierarchical organizations. They're used to wearing uniforms. They're used to rigid work hours. Again, this is obvious. And Lazarsfeld finally gets to his point saying, exactly, when every conclusion and its opposite appear equally obvious, of course, once you know the answer, there is a problem with the concept of obviousness itself. So the claim that I want to make tonight, and fast-forwarding 60 years, is that Lazarsfeld's observation is not just true for individual-level psychology and behavior, but really of all the explanations that we give about complex events in the world, right? So if you think about something that's happening now, right? So let's think about the European financial crisis that is sort of unfolding as we speak. When you look at Europe, it's a tremendously complicated situation, right? There are all sorts of things going on. There are all kind of potentially relevant factors, and they might lead to, in the future, all sorts of dramatically different outcomes. Everything from a total meltdown of the Eurozone to something far more benign, right? And we really, anyone who's sort of serious is not going to be able to voice sort of a sort of confident opinion about how it's all going to play out. But once the outcome is realized, and we can, if we look back at the last financial crisis, the one that we experienced in this country in 2008, we see a very different picture. That now that we know the outcome, now that we know what happened, we can sort of go through our grab bag of potentially relevant things, and we can pull out the few that now seem to be relevant, and we can stitch them together in this nice linear narrative that leads inevitably to the conclusion that we know happened, right? So it now seems obvious to us that we are in the midst of a huge housing bubble in this country. It seems obvious to us that mortgage lending standards were horrifically bad. It seems obvious to us that the sort of repackaging of mortgages through securitization was really sort of increasing systemic risk when in fact people thought it was the opposite. And all of this sort of obviously leads to the conclusion that we experienced. Now, there are two things I want to say about these kinds of explanations. The first one is that we can always construct them no matter what happens, right? So, we want to look back and we say, look, there were people warning us about the financial crisis. Why didn't we listen to Nouriel Roubini? Why didn't we listen to Bob Shiller? There were people who were ringing the alarm bells, and if only we'd listened to them, we wouldn't have made the mistakes that we made. But of course, there were lots of other people who were making the opposite predictions, right? People said just about everything about the housing market, and they said just about everything and made just about every prediction about the value or lack of value of financial derivatives. And so no matter what happened, somebody would have been right. Somebody's prediction would have been correct, and we can then go back and say that that person was right. So this is sort of Lazarsfeld's point, that no matter what outcome pertains, we can always go back and find an explanation that seems to inevitably lead to the conclusion that we've observed. The second point is that we can only do this once we know what the outcome is. It is only possible for us to determine what is relevant once we know what it is that we're trying to explain. So many of the way that we go through life is sort of surprisingly like reading an Agatha Christie novel. Like you're reading this novel and all this stuff is happening and clues are getting dropped and you're sort of wondering, like, which one should I be paying attention to? Which of these clues is relevant to the murder and which ones are just red herrings? And it's only at the end when Hercule Poirot sort of gives his masterful explanation that all is finally revealed and you know which ones the novelist was kind of inserting there just to distract you. And so life is sort of surprisingly like a mystery novel, that the explanations that we give after the fact really are just stories. They're stories in the sense that we can only tell them once we know the ending. And even though they give the appearance of telling us why things happen, they really just describe what happened. They just sketch out the series of events and then assert a causal explanation. Okay, so let me just go into that in a little more detail because it's sort of a controversial claim. So think about how we explain success, something that we love to do. And my favorite example of this is the Mona Lisa. So why is it the most famous painting in the world? Let me just ask a question. Who here has been to the Louvre in Paris? Most of you, yeah. So keep your hands up if you saw the Mona Lisa. Right, pretty much. Even some people who haven't been to the Louvre in Paris have seen the Mona Lisa. That's really impressive. So the Louvre estimates that roughly 80% of its many millions of visitors a year come exclusively to see, or primarily to see the Mona Lisa. And so people sort of wonder, well, let me ask you another question. When you finally get to see this thing, did you feel like a little disappointed? So I was actually in Paris a couple of weeks ago, very nice, almost as nice as Santa Fe. And I went to the Louvre, and here's the Mona Lisa. And unlike all these millions of people who go to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa, I go to the Louvre to see all the people who go to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa. This is what sociologists do. And so here's the crowd in front of the Mona Lisa. So you can see this is a phenomenally popular object of art. And you might legitimately wonder, what is it about the Mona Lisa that makes it so famous? And there are plenty of answers to this question that the art critics have. That there was this novel painting technique that Da Vinci invented in order to get that kind of shimmering, sort of dreamy finish. There was, of course, the mysterious subject who now we know as Lisa del Giocondo, but for many, many years, this subject was unknown. Of course, there's the Mona Lisa smile, this sort of enigmatic smile, which was very unusual for portraits up until that point. There was this sort of weird, fantastical background, which you might not see if you can't get close enough to it, but it has this sort of strange background that is sort of very different from the kinds of backgrounds that were common back then. And of course, it's Leonardo da Vinci, so you'd expect that to make a difference. So these all seem like perfectly plausible claims about the fame of Mona Lisa. But, in the very next room, we have this painting. Does anyone know what this painting is? No, I didn't think so. No. It's St. John the Baptist. And any guesses about the artist? It's Leonardo da Vinci. This is about 50 yards away from the Mona Lisa. And it's very interesting because he's got the same smile on his face that the Mona Lisa does. The background is actually also really kind of similar, right? The painting technique is exactly the same. And sitting right when you're like, wow, but it's not a picture of a woman. Well, this one is. And that's also Leonardo da Vinci, and that's about 6 feet to the right of the St. John the Baptist in this very next room. And any guesses how many people are looking at these masterpieces? Nobody, right? Nobody cares. So you might say, okay, really, why the Mona Lisa? And one can actually do this exercise more rigorously. And there's a great book by the historian Donald Sassoon called Becoming Mona Lisa, where he comes up with all these explanations like the ones that I just gave. And no matter what it is that you pick out about the Mona Lisa that you think makes it so great, you can always do this exercise of finding other works of art, often in the very same museum, that have the same attributes and that no one has ever heard of. So you could say, okay, fine, it's not any one of these attributes individually, it's the way they all combine, right? It's the combination of attributes that make the Mona Lisa so great. And this is more or less what Kenneth Clark, the art critic, says, where he claims that the Mona Lisa is the supreme example of perfection. Now, maybe Kenneth Clark is right, but the problem with this explanation is that it sort of eviscerates itself. That really, all it's saying is the Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world because it is more like the Mona Lisa than anything else is, right? It may be true, but it's also vacuous, right? And you think, okay, fine, the Mona Lisa, I don't really care about the Mona Lisa, so I don't really care why people think it's famous. I always thought it was silly anyway. But the claim that I want to make is that basically all the explanations that we give about success have exactly this same logical structure, right? So if you think about, why is Harry Potter, why was that so successful? Why is Facebook so successful? why is Donald Trump so successful, right? What about all those viral videos of talking babies and cats? Like, why did they get 100 million views and my talking baby didn't get any, right? You know, so the tendency that we have is to, I mean, the explanations that we give for all of these things is that they succeeded because they have, guess what, the attributes that they have, right? So Donald Trump may be sort of an ignorant, bombastic jerk, but he's exactly the right kind of ignorant, bombastic jerk, right? And we know that because look at how successful he is, right? So we can do that all right, and again, these explanations might be true, but really all they're saying is that X succeeded because X is more like X than anything else. They tell us only what succeeded, they don't tell us why at all. Okay, so I don't want to bash stories too much. Stories are certainly very, very powerful devices for helping us make sense of the world. They help us make sense of our own lives. They help us kind of stitch together our identity over time. They help us to relate to each other. They help us to relate to our past. Right? So stories are very, very powerful devices for making sense of the world. But again, they're so powerful that we're tempted to think that they're more than just devices for making sense of the world, that we actually want to generalize from them. We want to treat them as if they're causal explanations that we can use to make predictions about other things, particularly about the future. And if you don't think that we do this, this is George Santayana explicitly endorsing this particular strategy, where he says those that do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. So you have to go back and look at the past if you want to do a good job of predicting the future. Now, again, this is not always bad, right? If you get to repeat the same situations many times over, you can actually do a pretty good job of extracting cause and effect. Right? So if you think about professional training particularly of doctors, right? That the way it works is you throw trainees into situations that they're going to experience in their actual careers, and you make them do it over and over and over again until they actually learn how to respond when various symptoms present themselves. If you think about driving, commuting in traffic or commuting in any city between home and work, you do this hundreds of times, right? And, the daily rhythms, Wednesday might be different from Friday, but each Friday is more or less the same as every other Friday. And you can kind of learn over time which routes are going to get you home, how long it's going to take. So you don't have to have a total model of the city's traffic in your head to be able to solve this problem. But if you get to repeat the same things over and over again, you can do pretty well. The problem is that in these complex systems, these large-scale interacting systems that I was talking about, that we come up against in policy and politics and economics and marketing and corporate strategy, history never really repeats itself, right? That you're always dealing with something different. You never really get to solve the same problem hundreds of times or even dozens of times. You only ever really get to solve it once. And so even when we actively try, or especially when we actively try to learn from history, we encounter this law of unintended consequences, that we think we've learned the lessons of the last experience, and we take them and we apply them to the next experience, and then something else happens. Okay, so you're all depressed now. And so now I'm going to deliver this sort of good news, right? That yes, it's, that we're very attached to our intuition. We're very attached to our common sense. Whenever we think about, why people do what they do and how to make them do something differently, we're going to spontaneously come up with explanations and predictions that are going to seem very persuasive to us, and learning that all of this is far less reliable than it seems can be somewhat discouraging. But just as in AA, the first step of the solution is admitting that you have a problem, so too with common sense, the first step in doing something better, being more productive, being more accurate and more reliable, is first to admit to yourself that your intuition is not as reliable as it seems. Now, there's no sort of golden bullet here. There's no single thing that you can do once you learn to suspect your common sense and your intuition. There are, in fact, many things that you can do, and they're sort of, many of them are different from each other, and you have to be very careful to apply the right approaches in the right context. But they all start from the same point, which is acknowledging that you need them. And my model here is really just science. And if you cast your mind back even further than college, back to high school, where you probably learned about the scientific method, like really all the scientific method is a way to learn about the world when you don't trust your intuition. So what is the scientific method? You start with a hypothesis, which is a story often about, how the world works. And, if you think about some of the hypotheses that we have had in science over the millennia, some of them are pretty crazy, right? The Greeks used to think that eyesight worked by our eyes sort of projecting beams out into the world and feeling tactilely different surfaces, and then coming back and telling us what they'd found. Right? So this seems like a crazy idea. So people definitely had sort of intuitions that were completely off base, but the thing about the scientific method is you don't trust these intuitions. You design the experiment, you gather the data, you find out that almost certainly you were wrong, you modify your hypothesis, and you just sort of turn the crank, and you keep going through this over and over again. And over the last few hundred years, we have made tremendous progress in science by using this very simple procedure. And really, all of the claims that I want to make sort of come down to saying we can apply, or claiming that we can apply the same kind of thinking and the same kind of process to other fields that we don't traditionally think of as being scientific, things like policy, strategy, and marketing. So how to be a little more specific about that? Well, the first sort of general lesson is to learn what you can predict and what you can't. Right? So far, I've sort of indicated or I've emphasized our inability to predict things. But, actually it's not true that human behavior is always random, or even when it is random, that it's always unpredictable. In fact, there are a whole suite of applications in the real world that are pretty important to policy or to public health or to business, where it is sort of possible to make relatively reliable predictions, at least in the near future. So if you think about influenza, like whether any one of us gets the flu in the upcoming flu season is more or less a random event. But because there's lots of us, and because we're all sort of more or less independently exposed to the flu, it's actually relatively possible to predict reliably how many flu shots we're going to need in any given season. The same is true of the weather, where short-term, at least, weather forecasts are relatively reliable, and in industries like the companies that I work for, like Yahoo and Microsoft, there's a tremendous amount of machine learning and statistical modeling that goes into web search, and this is why when you type your query into a search engine, it sort of magically knows how to complete it, because it's just learning from the fact that millions of other people have conducted similar searches in the past, and you're probably looking for the same thing that they were looking for. So there are, in fact, lots of applications where we can actually make predictions based on historical data. And when you identify that your problem is in this category, there's lots of things you can do. There's statistical modeling, there's structural models, there's prediction markets, wisdom of crowds. There's a lot of sort of methods that I review in the book that you can use to try to improve the predictions that you make. And some of the research that we've done indicates that many of these methods are sort of roughly equivalent to each other. There's not sort of, sometimes you care about small differences, sometimes you don't. From our point of view, most of these methods are somewhat interchangeable. Really, the thing you want to avoid is relying on any one opinion, even when that's an expert opinion. So it's fashionable these days to bash experts and to say that they don't know anything because they're lousy at making predictions. And the truth is that experts are not worse at making predictions than other people. It's just that when we talk to experts, we have a tendency to overweight one opinion, and that's actually the problem, right? So the trap to avoid is paying too much attention to any one person, especially when that person is yourself, okay? And it's very hard. It sounds like an easy thing to avoid, but it's very hard to avoid because your opinions are just self-evidently correct, right? And your predictions are going to be right. And so you have to remind yourself whenever you're congratulating yourself on your great insight that you are probably wrong, okay? And that you should think of some other approach. Now, the main goal in all of this is to keep track. So, what's so interesting about the human, about prediction and people is that we love making predictions. We like making predictions about sporting games, about politics, about business, about all sorts of things going on in the world. we're really reluctant to keep track of the predictions that we make, right? Nobody does this, right? Nobody. So as a result, we sort of remember the predictions that we got right, and we tell everybody about those, and then we don't mention all the ones that we got wrong because we forget about them ourselves. And this is actually something that applies even to financial analysts. So if you keep track over time and you force yourself to write down, and your colleagues, they won't like you for this, but if you force you and your colleagues to write down all the predictions that you make in your professional lives, and then sort of keep them around until the outcomes realize themselves, you will learn over time which things you're good at predicting and which things you're not good at predicting. Now, if you do this, you will inevitably find that there are certain things that no one is good at predicting. Things like the next big technology trend, the next political revolution, the next financial crisis, the next bestseller, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, many of these sort of so-called black swan type events are the things that we most would like to be able to predict, right? And so, people are sort of constantly looking for the new version of the crystal ball that will help them to predict these kinds of events. But once you learn that you really, really can't predict these things, my advice to you is give up, right? What you should do instead is build strategies that don't require you to do what you can't do, right? If your strategy depends, the core of your strategy depends on accurately forecasting the next big technology trend, that is an extremely unreliable strategy. Okay, you might win, you might be Steve Jobs and get lucky, in which case everyone will think you're a genius, but for every one of those Steve Jobses that we have in the world, there are many, many people out there, and I've met many of them in my career, who think they know what the next big trend is going to be, and you have never heard of them, right? So instead of doing that, build strategies that don't rely on these accurate predictions. So what does that mean? Well, as it turns out, there's many decades, or at least a few decades, of history of what is called scenario analysis, where the whole objective is to think about very different versions of the future, which are designed precisely to challenge your assumptions, your often unstated assumptions about how things are going to unfold. And once you generate these different versions of the future, it's possible to build strategies that essentially hedge your risk across these different outcomes. And the theory, at least, is that this should reduce your exposure to unexpected outcomes. Now, of course, even this can go wrong because the world may do something that is out of bounds of any of the things that you have imagined it might do. And so then another way of thinking about planning is to forget about forecasting or prediction altogether and instead get very good at what I call measuring and reacting. So one of my favorite examples here is the Spanish clothing company Zara, who over almost 2 decades ago acknowledged to itself that it didn't know what was going to be the next trend in fashion. And so rather than trying to make a prediction about the new designs or the new colors for the fall, they instead adopted this measure and react approach, where they send a lot of people out into public areas, malls, shopping centers, and so on, and get lots and lots of ideas for what might be the next trend. So they exploit local knowledge. So this is one rule. The second is that they then generate lots and lots of bets, right? So they create lots of different designs and lots of different colors, and they manufacture them in very, very small batches, and then they put them out in their stores, and they effectively run a field experiment, right? And they measure in real time which things are selling and which things are not selling. They get rid of the ones that are not selling, and they didn't make too many of them in the first place, so it's not a big cost. And then they rapidly scale up the ones that are selling. And their ability to do this depends on them having a very, very fast production and distribution chain. So they can design and manufacture and ship anywhere in the world an item in about 2 weeks. So this is an interesting example for me because it's a very sort of pre-web example. They were doing this before the internet, but of course this is something that we can do much better now, even in an online environment. Okay, the final thing that I want to talk about is how to sort of think about the outcomes that you do observe. And so again, going back to success, if you read the business literature, you'll see that successful firms are typically evaluated as having visionary strategies, strong leadership, and focused execution, often laser-focused execution, right? And unsuccessful firms are the opposite. They don't know what they're doing. I used to work for one of those firms. People are always saying, what is Yahoo? It doesn't make any sense. It's not clear. You need some real leadership. You have lousy execution. So there's sort of a very strong signal in the way that we explain success in businesses that has to do with visionary strategy, strong leadership, and focused execution. What's so interesting, and this is the common sense view of this is that the process drives the outcome. That if you have a good process, you succeed, and if you have a bad process, then you fail. But as the management scientist Phil Rosenzweig has shown in this really fascinating book called The Halo Effect, it's actually the opposite. That our evaluation of the process depends on knowing the outcome. So we first observe that a company is successful, and then we just assume that whatever it is that it did was somehow, a visionary strategy, right? Even if we didn't know it at the time, right? So this is what Rosenzweig calls the halo effect. And the halo effect is this sort of well-known effect from psychology where, people who are tall are evaluated as being better leaders than people who are short. People who are good-looking are evaluated as being smarter than people who are not good-looking. So, of course, these attributes are basically uncorrelated in reality, but we consistently take one observable attribute and it casts a halo over the other attributes, right? And so exactly the same thing is true for success. Successful people, we assume that they're talented because otherwise, how could they be successful? So this is a really tricky one to deal with because if you can't evaluate a process based on the outcome, it's really very unclear what it is that you're supposed to do. And no doubt this is why we do it. And so the solution here, to the extent that there is a solution, is to really think very carefully about how many times you get to trial the process. So this is a theme that has come up several times tonight, where it really matters that you get to do the same thing over and over again. So if you think about baseball, right? Baseball is actually it's where you really can measure talent, right? You can argue about whether, batting average is a better measure of talent than runs batted in or slugging percentage or whatever your favorite metric is. That's unclear, which is the best measure. The point is that all of these measures are essentially inferred from tens of thousands of independent trials. So hundreds of at-bats per season, many thousands of at-bats over the course of a career, and each one is more or less an independent trial of skill. And so when you get that many observations that are independent of one another, you really have a very good measure of skill. The problem is that in most of the rest of life, it's not like that. Sports is almost the only thing in life that is like that, where we go to great lengths to recreate independent trials because we are interested in showing that one person is more skillful than another. In corporate strategy, you might just get one attempt, right? As many CEOs have discovered when they either succeeded and were lionized or failed and were fired. So what are you supposed to do? Well, to the extent that you can, try to evaluate talent or quality, whatever it is that you care about, over many independent observations, right? When this is not possible, you really just have to resist the temptation to assert that, to fall for the halo effect. You have to resist the temptation to judge talent or quality by the outcome. And this is difficult to do. It requires more work. You actually have to look at what a person does and how they did it and exactly what their contribution was and evaluate it directly. But it is possible. In my professional career, I have met many very sort of renowned, successful people, and when you meet them, you think, they're not so impressive, right? Likewise, I've met many people who no one has heard of, and they're fantastically smart and talented, right? And so when you actually really look at what people can do, it becomes very clear that there's a big gap between talent measured that way and success. And so the sort of old saying that, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich, is, ridiculous, not just because many people care about, outcomes other than making money, but simply because, talent is talent and success is success, and the two are not necessarily tightly connected. So what about the future? Well, for many decades, sociology is sort of roughly 100 years old as a field, and for all of this time, sociologists have had this sort of intuition that somehow the things they care about, the social facts of life, culture, markets, organizations, institutions, are sort of critically dependent on the interactions between people. But the problem is that for almost all of this time, it has been impossible to measure these interactions. You think about sort of social networks on the scale of hundreds of millions or billions of people. You can't really see them, you can't really observe them in everyday life. And it's very hard to do science when you can't observe the things that you care about. Right? If you don't have the data, it's hard to be scientific about it. And so what's so exciting about this current era in social science is that over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, the technological revolution of the internet and more broadly digital communications has actually started to make it possible to observe all of these interactions. So if we think about something like Facebook, it's sort of an incredible, like whatever you think of it as a company or whatever you think about it as a product, the data is incredible, right? You have 900 million people and all the connections between them. When I was a graduate student back in the mid-1990s, trying to understand like the structure of social networks, such a thing was unimaginable to me. Right? I literally thought about it and rejected it as impossible. And so we then went on this very, very long route of trying to sort of solve these problems using mathematical modeling and computer simulations because the empirical problem was impossible. Well, now it's not impossible, right? This thing actually exists. It's really incredible, and it's happening all over the place, not just Facebook, but everything that we do online and on our phones and through email and so on is leaving these digital traces that are sort of mapping out at a high level the economic and social activity of hundreds of millions of people. And one of the sort of analogs or analogies that people in my field like to draw is with the telescope, which, having been invented, Galileo turns it on Jupiter and observes the moons of Jupiter, and the use of this device by making the previously invisible visible, revolutionized all of celestial mechanics, and then through Newton, all of physics, and then eventually like all of science. And it's tempting to think that this thing called the internet may do for social science what the telescope and other devices did for physics. So, that's a long bow to draw, and one has to be cautious about these ambitions. But we are doing some pretty interesting things that literally wouldn't have been possible. We can track just a few years ago. We can track individual pieces of information flowing across an enormous network like Twitter in real time at the scale of hundreds of millions of such pieces of information. And we can make inferences about who influences whom and who's paying attention to whom totally automatically. We can run these virtual lab experiments using this site created by Amazon, Mechanical Turk, where we can bring people in from all over the world and have them participate in lab-style experiments where we wire them up in networks and we have them play games of cooperation or solve problems with each other, and we can manipulate the network structure in the background and start to ask questions about the causal relationship between network structure and collective dynamics. We can make predictions about real-world outcomes, things like movie box office revenues or video game sales, based on what people are searching for. Similar studies have looked at what people are tweeting about or what people are posting on Facebook. So there's all this data out there that, you think about the web as a kind of what people are doing, searching for and browsing and talking about as a kind of snapshot of the collective human consciousness, and ask what is that useful for. There are all kinds of predictions you might make from business to economics and even sort of community welfare and health that are of great interest. We can mine email and Facebook for the detailed structure of individual groups. We can even look at personal sites, dating websites, to see whether the preferences that people state about their partners are reflected by what they actually do. Right? This sort of notion of stated versus revealed preferences is something that's been very tricky for social scientists to get a handle on, when you can see that what people say they care about, in particular in this case, the race of their partners. And then you can also see what they click on. You get some interesting findings. Has anyone heard of this musical called Avenue Q? There's a song in it called Everyone's a Little Bit Racist. Though it turns out it's true. Everyone is, in fact, a little bit racist. And we can see that sort of leaping out of the data in this study of dating preferences. So there are all sorts of experiments and studies that are possible now that wouldn't have been possible just a handful of years ago. So it's interesting and exciting to think about what's going to be possible 3 or 5 or 10 years from now. Now, even with all of this data, I think that social science will never resemble anything like physics. I mean, there's been a long history, hundreds of years or at least a couple of hundred years of thinking in sociology, where the manifest desire has been to find in human behavior the kind of simple, general, even universal laws that we find in physics. And this has been so successful in physics that it's tempting to think that that's what science should look like. Well, social science is not going to look like that. The social world is just far too messy for that. And we will not find such simple or generalizable laws. But that really shouldn't be the point. The point of sociology or economics should not be to look like physics, but to actually solve empirical problems and explain the empirical world. And with all of this data, there's certainly some hope that we might be able to do that. And not only do I think this will be transformative for social science, but I think that, and I certainly hope that, as we continue to make progress, as people become more accustomed to trusting data over their intuitions, then maybe this will even have an impact in business and in policy. So thank you very much for paying attention. If you found this interesting, the book here has a lot more in it. I was only able to go into things, and there's a lot that I glossed over this evening. But thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Do we have any time or enthusiasm for questions? Somebody over there on the far right, yeah.
Your preferred strategy, business strategy, certainly seems to say, look, keep your eye on the trends. What the trend is discernible, react quickly and get on board. That seems to be the strategy, and your company, Microsoft, has followed for the last decade or so. What went wrong?
Well, one of the interesting things about assessing corporate strategies is that just wait a couple of years and maybe you won't be saying that anymore. When you evaluate things, makes a big difference to how you evaluate them. But yeah, I'm certainly not responsible for Microsoft's strategy. That's as a scientist, I would be terrified to be somebody in charge of running a multi-billion-dollar business, because it's really not. At some level, it's not possible to be scientific about it. Sometimes you really do just have to make your best bet and go with it. I think that there are ways to improve on that, and that one should always be, sort of mindful of those ways. But yes, it's not a place for a scientist running a company like any of these. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So is this not relevant to the complex policy issues?
Well, what I said was that you have to differentiate when you can make predictions from when you cannot, right? And so so this is what you learn by trying to make. So if As somebody, the Economist pointed out recently, that we don't have access to future data, right? So the only data we can use is historical data, right? And if that turns out not to be relevant, then you have a problem, okay? And I think there are striking examples that we find interesting, like financial crises, for example, that are interesting and striking to us precisely because they do not correspond to historical data. And so, there may be still things that you can do. Like so one of the reasons why prediction markets are so popular these days is there's a thought that your statistical model can only train itself on historical data, but humans can at least imagine a world that's different from what has been, from what has happened in the past. And so you might be able to extract better predictions for policy analysis from a prediction market than you can from a statistical model. So far I think the evidence is unpersuasive that this is actually true in practice, but these are the kinds of things that we need to learn a lot more about. And of course, one of the things that we'll learn is that there are some things that we really can't predict, which is when all these other kinds of methods kick in. Yes, over there, by the aisle.
I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher.
Okay.
And in philosophy, there is a tradition of distinguishing between estimation and prediction.
Yes.
And one of the things I found in your were fully on the side of prediction, and not very good at estimation. Just standard historical example is the Babylonian astronomers were able to predict very, very accurately what the people doing phenomena. They couldn't understand the phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
They had no explanation.
Mm-hmm.
They required the Greek development of astronomy in order to start making sense of why celestial phenomena occurred. Now, the same thing seems to be true all over the place. There is a distinction. Being able to predict is not the same thing.
So you're right. So I'll just restate the question. So difference between prediction and explanation. Absolutely. It's certainly possible to make predictions without having a causal model, right? And maybe that's fine, right? Maybe for some things you actually do just want to make predictions. All of statistical machine learning, which actually, this is why, your autocompletes work on search engines. There's no causal model there. There's no explanation. It's just a statistical model. But it's still very useful, right? So there's some applications where you only care about prediction. Sometimes you do care about explanation, but why do you care about explanation, right? You want to be able to generalize from what you know to something else, right? And if you can't, okay, so I would challenge you to think about what it means to explain something if you cannot generalize from that one data point. If you have a story about why something happened and it only applies to that one thing, right, then I don't actually agree with you that that's an explanation, right? And so there is so again, in machine learning, there is this sort of interesting equivalence that I'm guessing you would reject between prediction and explanation. It's called out-of-sample testing. So it's not about, so when you train a model on your data, right, there's a risk of overfitting, right? So you can perfectly explain your data simply by throwing in a parameter for every data point that you observe. The problem with a model like that is that it doesn't generalize to anything else, right? So it actually is not considered to be a real explanation. And so the way to catch yourself and prevent yourself from doing that is to train your model on training data and then test it on data that the model hasn't seen yet, right? So this is called out-of-sample testing, right? So it's not making a prediction about the future, but it is being forced to be evaluated on things it hasn't seen. So in that sense, you are equating predictive power with explanatory power. And I think that's a very powerful insight that comes out of machine learning, and it's something that we do very, very badly when we try to explain historical events, because what we're doing there is effectively overfitting. We have an essentially infinite number of parameters, and we have one outcome to explain, and we can always do that, right? The problem is that we can't generalize from those explanations, and that is what I'm saying is the problem, okay? So there's a question down here.
So in terms of the telescope analogy,
Yeah.
the availability of all this data on online search To what extent do you think they also teach us about the laws of sociology, which there are, to the extent that there are any, in offline social interaction?
Okay, so the question is, we have all this data, but it's in some sense a very biased sample of 2 points really. You're making 2 points. One is that online social interactions may be systematically different from other kinds of social interactions, right? And other kinds of phenomena that really that have at least not yet been translated into an online environment. And so you might wonder about like how much you can learn about this sort of dark matter by looking at the stuff that we can observe. The other point is that these companies and these products and services are not just helping us to measure things, but they're also changing the thing itself. They're changing society. They are social phenomena themselves. And that's so both. I totally agree with both of these points, right? That I don't want to. I think it's certainly something to worry about whether how much you can generalize beyond what we can measure, right? The first point, and that's always true, right? I mean, anything, all of social science before now had the same problem, right? Which is that you do an experiment in a lab, and you sort of learn something interesting about some psychological bias, but there's always the question of like, well, what have you learned about human behavior out there in the wild, right? So survey research, you go and ask people what they say they would do under some circumstances, but you don't actually know that that's what they're going to do under those circumstances. So every measurement device has its limitations, and I don't want to sort of present this as sort of a, somehow exempt from that general rule. And then the other question about like, they're actually also changing the thing that we're trying to understand. This is one reason why it's never going to be like physics, right? Electrons don't care that you understand them, right? They just keep doing whatever they're doing. Okay, net of the uncertainty principle, okay? So lots of electrons together don't care that you understand what they're doing, and atoms probably behave the same way now as they did, certainly for all of human history and maybe all of history. So and humans are not like that. It's a moving target, and I think we're never going to be able to say, yes, we got it, because as soon as we do, and people try to act on that, then it'll change how people behave. Which is fine. I mean, you don't want a world in which, some like evil social scientist can sort of sit there, pulling the levers and, making us all jump around like robots. I don't think anybody wants that. So, really the goal has to be sort of a different kind of goal, not necessarily a more modest goal, but a different kind of goal, which is like, let's just try to do the things that we're currently doing a little bit better than we're doing them. Let's not sort of imagine that we are going to have a sort of always correct universal theory of everything, but that we're going to have lots of, what Robert Merton called theories of the middle ground, right? That theories that are somewhat generalizable, that apply to more than just one situation, but that are reasonably sort of context-specific, such that they have empirical power. So I think, to me, that's that's really the objective. Yes, over here.
At some point in almost all these questions, there seems to be a rather difficult point at which you have to choose a level of course grading. So you say, you can't see this one thing happen over and over and over, but what if you move back the level of course grain a little bit so that it looks like something sort of similar is happening?
Yep. Well, I would say, coming back to the explanation question, like if you can predict, then so you have to say, look, I never exactly the same thing never ever happens twice, right? But I have lots of instances of like roughly similar things, right? So how do I know that something is similar to something else? Well, it's because it has the same relevant features, right? How do I know what those relevant features are? Because similar things share the same relevant features. So there's a circularity here which philosophers call the frame problem. And it's really a tough one, right? No one can solve this problem. In practice, though, like, we do solve the problem, right? In practice, I mean, this is the way common sense works. Like, it actually really does work, right? Because, when you go to a foreign culture, or you come into some sort of unfamiliar situation, or, God forbid, you join the Navy, right? Like, you will screw up, right? You will go in there and you will do all these crazy things. You will wear the wrong uniform to dinner, right? And you will be deeply humiliated, right? Or you will say the wrong thing at the wrong time, or you'll use the wrong intonation to the wrong person, and you will make these mistakes, right? But then you'll learn, and because like tomorrow is more or less the same as today, your learning will apply, right? So I think a similar sort of rule of thumb applies to this more sort of analytical approach, where you're taking historical data and you're testing it to see if you can make predictions. This is what we do in sort of behavioral targeting in the online world, is that you have these sort of very complicated models. They're trained on historical data, and you actually just measure whether they're working or not. And so this is not a theoretical solution, right? I don't think there is a perfect theoretical solution, which is the point you're raising. But I think in practice you can do better, and that's really, for me, that would be great. Okay, last one over here. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So the question is, as all of this sort of, let's assume that this science does become very powerful and good at making predictions. Is it not just all going to be harnessed by, corporations to manipulate consumers for their profits, or political parties to manipulate you to go along with whatever it is that they want to do? This is it's an absolutely real thing to worry about, right? That, just as we worry about, sort of trading off between consumer privacy and expectations to privacy and the utility of data in providing, novel and useful services. I think the general point, though, is no different from anything in science, right? Physics has very, very frequently throughout human history been not just harnessed, but also actively sponsored for the purposes of war, right? And that's regrettable. And I think you can argue about is it worth it, right? But the fact is that has driven a tremendous amount of scientific progress, and some of those discoveries have been used for socially deleterious outcomes, and others have been used for social good. And that is a separate argument, and I think it's worth keeping a watchful eye on all of science, whether it's biology or physics or social science, and asking, this is something that is sort of funded by by taxpayers ultimately, and in this case, the data is coming from the citizens as well. There's a right to have some sort of say in whether the outcome of all of this is a sort of net benefit or cost for society. I think it's a perfectly reasonable question, and I don't shy away from it at all. But I don't think that it's also a deal breaker, right? It's not, and it's something that we're familiar with and that we've dealt with in other sciences over time. We're just going to have to do it again. Great, thank you.
I have even more faith than Duncan, and I think that when social science has been around for the 2,000 years that physics has been, we indeed will be able to predict the behavior of human beings, at least at the level of the collective, as we can with electrons and protons. I want to actually just say one more thing, and that is, for those of you who are early birds, your radio station KSFR will have an interview with Duncan that will be aired at 8 a.m. in the morning when I will be soundly asleep. But I hope that you will listen. Thank you very much again for coming, and let's thank Duncan again one more time.